All right.
Yeah.
My name is Jeff Paterson, and I am part of the National Board of Veterans for Peace. And myself and my other national board member, Jeremiah Knowles, are hosting this on behalf of the Veterans for Peace Ukraine Working Group. And to be fair, it's pretty clear that Veterans for Peace is disowning us as a working group. We were initially the Veterans for Peace for Ukraine working group, and then we were told we couldn't do that. Then we were the Veterans for Peace for Ukraine caucus, and we were told we couldn't caucus. Today, we are the Veterans for Peace Ukraine working group, and at the next meeting, I assume we will be told we cannot do that either. However, despite us being told that we do not exist, we are still here. We are talking to our friends and holding this third webinar that we hope is making some difference in the world. And with that, I will introduce John Spitzberg, a member of Veterans for Peace from Alaska, who has just returned from Ukraine. John will give us some brief remarks on that, and then our primary speakers, Carl Mirra and Oksana Dudko, will be our primary presenters, and then Sasha will run our question and answer, and that'll take us 90 minutes. So John, tell us about your trip.
Okay, can everyone hear me okay? Raise your hand if you can hear me. Okay, great. So my name is John Spitzberg. I'm 84 years old. I'll be 85 this month. And I went to Odessa actually because in the year 2022, last year, I spent a month and a half in Romania, in Bucharest, working with refugees from Ukraine. And I carried luggage. I served coffee, food, etc. And I worked with a lot of people who were from Ukraine. They were refugees, but they stayed and they decided that they wanted to also work as volunteers at Gare du Nord, which is the huge railroad station where many refugees came. And so that's what I did. And I became entranced with the notion that I should go to Odessa. And some of the people who were from Odessa loved the idea of seeing an American ex-military guy dedicated to the sovereignty of their nation, namely Ukraine. But I couldn't go at that last year. And so this year, I went back to Romania, and I took a bus at 1 o'clock in the morning, and it took about 12 hours to get there, but I got to Odessa. And I found that in Odessa, most of the men were gone. The women were there with their children. I was at a place called the Deribas Hotel, which is in an old part of Odessa, a very beautiful part, with parks and roadways with commercial stores and everything, and all of that was working. People were living their lives to the best of their ability, and because I don't speak Russian and I don't speak Ukrainian, and because I was alone, I had to rely on people who could speak some English or German or French or Spanish or a little bit of Vietnamese, which I know because I lived in Vietnam at one time. Okay, so here's what I want you to hear very clearly. The patriotism in Odessa and actually in all the towns that the bus passed through, the patriotism was incredible. The flags flew beautifully. The people were literally thankful that an American with a hat, this is the hat I wore, the peace hat, they recognized that and they smiled. And I spoke with a few people in a park, a huge park, while their children played on the swings and whatever. By the way, I'm a former special ed teacher and a social worker. So that's what I come to you two from. And I love playing around and watching the kids. And everyone, except for one, every person that I somehow communicated with, in their own way said, Ukraine must exist. Ukraine must be considered by the world a sovereign nation. And I'm really paraphrasing because I'm not sure that that's what they told me, but everyone that I met, old folks like me, middle-aged, young folks, a lot of the women, very few men. And the only men that were young that I saw were people in the military, many of whom carried their weapon on the back of their on their backs. What I have to say to you is this: Ukraine is a sovereign nation, having been attacked by a country 4 times its size, and that, to me, is bullying. And I thought I'd do a little bit of show and tell, because that's what I am, a teacher, and I was a special ed teacher. So let me just take this over here, and hopefully you can see it. That's the vest that I wore when I went there. That's the vest that I used when I worked with the refugees. One side is in Romanian, the other in Ukrainian with my name. This is a flag that right here, hopefully you can see it behind me. This is a flag that I brought back, signed by many of the people from the volunteer center that still remains in Romania. So I don't know if this is of any use to you, but it's show and tell. And over here are the things that I received as an outstanding volunteer. Okay, so and here, if you can see it, is the snow falling in Anchorage, Alaska, and the cars you can see have snow on them. So that's about 6 minutes, Jeff. I don't want to take up more time, but let's hear it for Ukraine. And let's hope that this war ends soon and that Russia returns to its own land, and that we have peace for all humanity, and particularly for the Ukrainians who have suffered. Thank you.
Thank you, John. Again, since this is a Veterans for Peace Ukraine Working Group webinar today, I wanted to give John a chance, as a Veterans for Peace member, having returned from Ukraine, share some brief reflections. Again, so much of the progressive Western left, we talk in our own echo chambers, we fight with each other via keyboards, and you know, instead of actually getting out into the world, seeing what's going on, talking to the people actually affected by Russia's invasion of Ukraine. So today's webinar, Ukraine 2014, Today What Next? And I picked that title just because I keep hearing that Ukraine was a happy place with a democracy up until 2014. And then Ukrainians, under the influence of the CIA, overthrew their democratically elected government. And then Nazis took over. And then Russia had to step in and help. And then everything that's happened sort of hinged on that day back in 2014. And I don't want to jump into it. You guys are the experts. And at this point, I'm going to turn it over to Sasha to introduce herself, and then Carl. Thanks, Sasha.
Thank you so much, Jeff. And thank you for starting. And I wanted to reflect a little bit on what John had said, because my parents are now in Odessa. And the interesting thing, I mean, it's not cheering, but I find it interesting that my mom says that the city life in Odessa is very, very bright, is very as before, let's say, as if nothing happened. But at the same time, of course, there's war. So people live in this constant contradiction between war and peace, and they always like people say it's normal to after a big tragedy to go for a party or for a birthday party. Like, you don't have to cancel birthday party if something bad just happened. That's something we never talked about before, but right now it's the new normal. And I mean, you can treat it differently, but I wanted to share this because I think it's something which is not so common. Yeah, and so who am I? I am Sasha Kanster from Ukraine, from Feminist Workshop. And Feminist Workshop is an NGO, a feminist NGO in Ukraine, in the western part of Ukraine, which was founded in 2014, and it's a grassroots organization. And it's a big thing actually for Ukraine, because NGOs were not a thing for some time. So we had to actually search for people from whom to learn how to do an NGO and so on. And it was founded in 2014, and it's not a coincidence, because it has a relation to the events of 2014, not direct, but let's say the people who founded Feminist Workshop participated in the Maidan, and then they had their own feelings and feminist ideas about the future of Ukraine, and they united. Okay, I'm also a historian, and I wrote my master thesis about experiences of women in the eastern part of Ukraine during the anti-terrorist operation, it was called back then, from 2014 until 2016. Yes. Also, I saw some raised hands in the attendees panel, and I wanted to say that it's nice to use the Q&A section for your questions, and I will read them all in the end after we hear the panelists, and there will be a chance to address your questions. Yeah, okay, then I want to introduce Carl. And Carl is an amazing person from what I could find about him. And he was a soldier in the US Marine Corps during the first Gulf War. He wrote books, and he's a writer. And he has a unique academic and veteran perspective on the things that we talk about today. So I think I will pass the mic, the virtual mic, to Carl.
Hi there. Thank you very much, Sasha. Jeff, can I get share screen privileges? Always a nice smooth start. Never mind, the title was for another presentation that I did elsewhere, but I just want to say that my presentation, my research on Ukraine is derived in large part from research that I conducted in Ukraine to avoid what some Ukrainians call West-splaining. I was able to travel across most of Ukraine, thousands of kilometers from Lviv to Donetsk. And I interviewed people from warehouse workers, to gas station attendants, to grocery store clerks, to a university rector, to teachers, to a general, to Azov regiment members, and just about everybody else. And I conducted a public opinion survey as well. So that is the basis for much of my opinion making, if you will, today. The title really refers to the home of Yanukovych. It's actually quite funny before I go into it, but you know, when he knew he was going to be ousted and he fled, before people normally realized he fled, they were throwing his paperwork into the river, but it was in plastic sheets. I would say something different, but I'll hold it. I don't know the audience. So literally all his documents and financial corruption was thrown into the river in plastic sheets. And then there was a golden loaf, literally. I thought there was some kind of secret thing, but it was a golden loaf, just a huge piece of gold made into a loaf of bread. And it's just an example of his ostentatious corruption that people were voting against. And then Slavyansk is the origin or the start for some people of the war in April 2014 that I'll talk about. So I think it's very important to get into the nitty-gritty details of the causes of the war because they're not very well understood by Western audiences. An accurate, true understanding of these causes will help us to develop a durable, lasting conflict settlement, not a conflict settlement that achieves Russia's war aim, which is the destabilization of Ukraine through federalization. And we know that from leaked documents. So that's very important. So when I hear people say that in the West, that we should just federalize Ukraine, some of Epstein's friends like Noam Chomsky, it's very upsetting. It's very upsetting to hear those things because that's actually Russia's war aim. Moving on to my next, actually I should do slideshow from the beginning. I don't like to quote the US government, but they do keep track of Russian propaganda, as do I. And they were able to, you know, distill it into a set of, can people see this on the screen? This nonsense? Yeah, I can't seem to get this off of here, but I'll do this.
Yeah, it's good.
It looks good
Okay,
now,
yeah.
Carl.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right, so there's major narratives that the Russians send out into information sphere. Two of them are interests of mine, so I focused on them. One is that Russia is a victim. Usually imperial powers like to cast themselves as victims of somebody. And they're a victim of US destabilization campaigns. There's some truth to this, as a kernel of truth, but there's very little to no truth that US was destabilizing Ukraine and overthrew Ukraine's President Viktor Yanukovych. We will see that in a moment with some heavy duty evidence. And that the Western provocation through NATO expansion, if I had time, I have a chart on how there's also a gross exaggeration, given the fact that Russia has consistently sold weapons to NATO countries, repaired Eastern European countries, MiG fighter jets, Mi-17 helicopters, was conducting joint exercises with NATO's into September 2013, and was continuing to make helicopter deals with the Pentagon as late as September 2013, even according to Sputnik News. But that's not for today's presentation. So really, these narratives are cover for Russia's imperial ambitions, what Lavrov, foreign minister, calls zone of responsibility near abroad, or people like John Mearsheimer and others will call spheres of influence, as if we're heading back to 19th century imperialism, as if it's a good thing. But they're really concealing Russia's covert hybrid war and desire for frozen conflicts that we see in Georgia and around the region. So this is from a Russian source, not the best chart, but Novosibirsk was their original goal. It's a term that comes from Catherine the Great. So if we want to go back to the 18th century, along with Putin and the Russians, they were going to restore Novosoria, which is southeastern and southern part, actually the southern part of Ukraine. Those are the regions. And this is really interesting to note. Sometimes just looking at things can really break down narratives. If you look at all those oblasts that are listed, only two was there any success, and they were partially, minimally successful in those areas. So the Great Novosoria New Russia project was an absolute failure. So I don't know the motive for 2022. Few of us do. We don't have the documents, but it looked like destabilization through outright regime change or conquering Ukraine. How do we know this? Well, we know this because RIA Novosti, the Russian official state news agency, on February 26th, ran a story that subsequently took down for its embarrassment and foolishness and its viciousness. But of course, the Internet Archive has things that are available, so you can just go on the Internet Archive and get it. It said, quote, "Russia is restoring its historical fullness, gathering the Russian world, returning Ukraine. Did someone in the old European capital seriously believe that Moscow would give up Kyiv? This is its return to the historical space. This is consistent with Putin's July 2021 essay on the unity of peoples, meaning Belarus, Ukraine, and Russia, that they share the same historical and spiritual space. So basically, when Moscow thought it was going to win and it was roundly defeated to try to take Kyiv, it was saying we're here to conquer Kyiv and return Ukraine to Russia. Then another article followed, really a vile article in RIA Novosti. This has not been taken down because Russians believe this and they think it's okay to say these things. But denazification, it says, will basically mean de-Ukrainianization, hard to even say that made up word. But Ukraine, it's impossible as a nation state, is an artificial anti-Russian construction. The Banderite elite must be liquidated. Of course, they're referring to Stefan Bandera, but they never referred to the nationalist independence movements of 1917 to 1922 that the Bolsheviks helped to destroy. And they were actually part of the Ukrainian progressive movement and the National Democratic movement and basically liberals. Those are never mentioned here in the West, but Bandera, of course, is. And the goal of the special military operation is understood as a military victory over the Kiev regime. So clearly, the official state news agency of Russia was declaring it was conquering Ukraine. Indisputable. How did that play out in the real world? This is part of my oral history to humanize it. Here we have a Banderite walking into her home. I'm being sarcastic. This is Zoya at a home in Irpin, and that's her home. And she walks with a cane, a medically assisted cane, and she wanted to go to the home to conduct the interview to show me what the Russians did to her house. She remains steady and strong and resilient like so many Ukrainians throughout the interview. But then she told the story. This is really fascinating on Russian propaganda. She was talking to her relatives in Russia. She had called them up and they said to her, "You're a Banderite. Don't ever call us again," and hung up the phone. And I noticed she was crying. She had tears coming down her eyes and could not compose herself at that moment. So that is the marvels of Russian disinformation to sort of separate families as well, with fiction and fantasy, caricature and cliche. That's if you ride through Irpin, you'll see that all over the place. You will note that those windows are people's homes where women and children and fathers and mothers were sleeping. This is known as the badass babushka of Irpin. That's how she's described, because she was feeding Ukrainian soldiers while tanks were surrounding her home. She defied them. And I just read from her the human element of the war. "I saw body parts around. Heads and legs were just lying on the ground. We were very close to Kiev. Irpin hampered the Russian advance to Kiev." The Battle of Irpin, actually, the people really helped amazingly. It should go down in history to stop Russia from conquering Ukraine. "I was chopping firewood. I felt something fly past me, and suddenly I saw a cloud of smoke. The first floor of my house fell. My washing machine was thrown to the stadium. I rushed to the house, screaming to my son, 'Victor, we're burning, we're burning.' My house was burning, and I saw my son running out of the house, and he was on fire." And she later, with tears in her eyes, said, "I'm 80 and I have nothing. She also gave me a mandate when I told her some of the narratives that people say in the United States about Banda rights, about Zelensky not following his peace platform and other things that they made up because people never bothered to read the peace platform. She said, please go back and correct their blankety blank that I will not repeat here because we're in polite company. So one of the big Russian narratives that I really want to break down is what somebody in the chat was putting. They think they're very clever because the US gave money to Ukraine to help build democratic structures, which they were very, very open about. And the evidence in quotation marks, that the US overthrew the democratically elected government of Viktor Yanukovych, who's also, part of a chain of corrupt leaders in Ukraine. His dentist son became one of the wealthiest people in the country. He was from Donbass in the east and is pretty much known as a mafia-style family clan ruler. But anyway, that aside, Victoria Nuland, Assistant Secretary of State, and Gregory Payette, Ambassador to Ukraine, were on the phone. And this is interesting, just subject things to a little timeline. So on January 28th, Payette is talking to Nuland, and Nuland makes a famous statement that we could midwife this thing and put Yats into power, Yatsenyuk, who then does become prime minister. Oh my goodness, that must be a smoking gun evidence of a coup. However, just a little timeline, a little knowledge. First of all, Yatsenyuk, Klitschko, Tyahnybok, they were all very public figures. They were the opposition. So the fact that they were talking about them, there's nothing conspiratorial about it. They were open in the public as the opposition for months, and they were talking with Yanukovych and so on for months. So the fact that they're bringing them up means nothing, but that's beside the point. That's not going to convince people. 3 days before that phone call, Yanukovych met with Yats in the phone call. Before the phone call, he met with him and said, why don't you become prime minister? Okay, so the fact that Nuland said what Yanukovych said does not prove a coup. And then afterward, on February 20, actually the overnight of February 20 to 21 over some vodka, Yanukovych again met with the three, the opposition leaders, Klitschko, the boxer, Yatsenyuk, and Tyahnybok, who's the far right, and said, Yats, why don't you become prime minister? So again, before and after the Nuland phone call, Yanukovych agreed to this arrangement. So there's no evidence of a coup there unless you want to create some wild fiction in your mind. And according to the Polish foreign minister, who's doing a Twitter play-by-play of this meeting, Yanukovych received a phone call from Putin to iron out the deal, and Putin's representative was on scene as well. So if anyone tells you that the Nuland phone call is evidence of a coup, it means they have no idea what the historical timeline was. You could just trace it back, and it's quite silly, to be honest. Now, it's not only silly, it's demeaning and degrading to Ukrainians. And it's demeaning and degrading because it seems to suggest that Ukrainians would be happy to have a corrupt leader who engages in militarized police violence against their families and children. So of course people are angry about that, and they revolted against that. And the narrative is that this deal that Yanukovych cut with the opposition would have been taken if not for the right sector, if not for Svoboda and other Nazis who are running Ukraine. They can never name a single Nazi or pinpoint how they're running Ukraine, but they keep repeating it like parrots and echoing straight from the disinformation narrative. But it wasn't the right wing who said this. It was Paryusik, who was an independent, a little fiery. He's kicked people in Narada in the parliament, but nonetheless, he's an independent. He's not part of the right sector. And in fact, perhaps for historical reasons, in that fiery speech, when he said, Yanukovych, you have to leave by 10 a.m. or we're throwing you out, he said before that, and this is amazing, it's almost like, come on, people from the West, come on, Chomsky, come on, Benjamin, read what he said, read what he said. He said, I'm not the right sector. We are not the right sector. He pointed to the crowd. He said, we are hundreds of thousands of people. We are ordinary people. And the ordinary people of Ukraine are fed up with corruption. My friend was just killed. He leaves a wife and a baby. Get out of here by 10 a.m. or else, right? So that's not the right sector. That's the Ukrainian people fed up with corruption. And in fact, I got this from Emily Channel Justice of the Harvard Ukrainian Institute. Should read her book, because she talks about and documents the left the left movements at Maidan and how they were dominating the discussions. But anyway, that graphic there is a sticker, and on that sticker it says something to the effects that I will not leave Maidan till Yanukovych resigns, and that was long before Newland, long before any of these conversations take place. They were appearing there for months. So another slogan that came out of Maidan was, "We will protect our children," because Yanukovych's militarized police were killing people, we're killing kids, we're killing students. So the Ukrainian movement was a movement against corruption and militarized police violence so that people could have dignity. It's also called the Revolution of Dignity, but not just dignity in the sense that you and I, as we, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, I have my individual right to dignity. It's kind of like, finally, maybe we could have a society of dignity, right? Live with some dignity type of thing. And these Western commentators who follow Russian disinformation want to take that dignity away from Ukraine by making it appear like their struggles for dignity were somehow orchestrated by the US. It's one thing to hear a conservative person say that, but for the American left, it's really unforgivable. It really is, it's a horrifying narrative for leftists to be promulgating. And it takes a complete ignoring of the historical record to arrive at one's own predetermined conclusions. But anyway, this movement toward more democratic, non-corrupt society was evident among the Nestor group. There's a famous Ukrainian historian, such a difficult name to pronounce. You have to forgive my limitations on that, but he's part of the Nestor group. And they published this too at the time. They looked at the World Value Survey and they said revolution in spring 2013, revolution is in the air because there's a high priority on tolerance among Ukrainians. There's a rising demand for participation in decision-making in the economic and political life. So they felt that brewing in the air already. So when we have all these ideas that the US, the CIA orchestrated a coup, once you prove that wrong, then it's nonsense. Oh, then it was the far right who did it. Then it was the right sector. No, it was the Azov. So it couldn't just be the Ukrainian people fighting for their freedom and independence and dignity. You know, that couldn't possibly be the case. But anyway, if what that conceals is a new generation, a new wave, we're really embracing democratic values. And there's something called the Program for International Student Assessment. It usually tests kids in math and science, but there's also a mental value survey as well. And Ukrainian kids score above the norm on a growth mindset. So there's a move toward getting away from those old Soviet, accepting Soviet mindset of accepting corruption, of, a little paranoia. And there's a new school movement too, the 2016 New Ukrainian School Concept, that really focuses on teacher autonomy, decision-making, democratic values, self-actualization. So to portray Maidan as a US coup, to portray it as a right-wing movement, erases and diminishes and devalues an entire new generational movement focused on democratic practices and values that we supposedly believe in here among the American left. So moving on, maybe it wasn't the US who is destabilizing, maybe Russia's projecting its own destabilization. Well, why would I say that? Well, there's other phone calls. I never hear about these phone calls in the US dialogue and discussion. There's the Glazev leaks and the Surkov leaks. Sergei Glazev was an advisor to President Putin, a long-term member, a veteran politician in the Duma, and Vladislav Surkov was also an advisor to Putin in charge of Donbass policy, and an advisor for 2 years and a deputy prime minister as well. So they're important, high-level, high-ranking officials. And out of the Glazev leaks, there's also Frolov leaks, who was a low-level functionary who worked for Glazev. I know, starting throwing names around, it might be confusing. But in those leaks, a document was revealed. And that document was obtained by Ukrainian journalists, and it was called On a Set of Measures to Involve Ukraine in the Eurasian Integration Process. That document is in a leaked email, and it matches up with what the Ukrainian newspapers printed. And I can't see my full screen here, but it basically says something to the effect, this is in summer 2003, Yanukovych is overthrown in February 2014. In the summer of 2013, this is how Moscow is talking about Yanukovych, okay? Yanukovych, because of his ignorance, he is provoking large-scale protests, and we will wait for the collapse, and we will do this by the formation of an influential network of pro-Russian forces, but we cannot show the hand of Moscow. And the personnel that we'll find for this will be among the South and Eastern Ukrainians. So they're legitimately in this document explaining how they're waiting for the ouster of Yanukovych and may be willing to accelerate that. At the same time, this is also never mentioned, Putin is doing his policy of customs wars, gas wars. So he put highly restrictive tariffs on Ukraine's products. In late January, even he did it when Yanukovych was negotiating. He went from like a 5% tariff to something like a 40% tariff. So Putin was undermining Yanukovych and was not a big fan of Yanukovych either. What Putin is a big fan of is a destabilized, chaotic Ukraine. Right? So keep that in mind. Now, here's Guns of April or August. Of course, that is a spin on the words of World War I. So these Surkov leaks, and that'll make sense in a moment, also expose a large-scale effort on how Russia funded local elections, bribed law enforcement, bribed journalists, infiltrated NGOs, staged protests, and it reveals this Novorossiya, new Russia policy where they're going to try to create, subsume the lands of southern Ukraine. But as I said, it failed. It failed miserably because people in those regions were not interested in it. And even in the regions where they were, we're going to see how Russia got them interested when they weren't. And basically the policy is destabilization through federalization. I don't know if these faces mean anything to anybody, but the guy on the upper left is Konstantin Malofeyev, a wealthy tycoon who is Kremlin connected. And according to the separatists, and according to an interview he did in a Russian newspaper, he helped fund this movement. And then he said, of course, it was just humanitarian aid. But he was in Crimea, along with the person on the bottom left-hand corner is the maniacal former FSB officer Igor Girkin, known as Streklov, the shooter. He's accused of shooting down the Malaysian MH17 flight. I don't know if that's true or not, but he is a maniacal person. And next to him is Alexander Borodai. The three of them, coincidentally, former FSB officer, Russian citizen, soon to be Russian Duma member, were in Crimea in January 2014. And Girkin, recognized by a Russian journalist, was at the Crimea parliament where two people were killed in February. Somehow, these gentlemen made their way to Donetsk in April 2014. It seems everywhere there goes, some type of melee happens, maybe just a coincidence. But Borodai, publicly, these people are really amazing. They're on YouTube, and they had their own Russian Spring newspaper. Borodai, who worked also for Malofeyev, I don't know if this is getting confusing, publicly said that Surkov, the person who was the aide to Putin, provides Donetsk People's Republic with serious support, and he's our man in the Kremlin. And Girkin added that Surkov has the respect of Mr. Putin. So I don't know if I went too fast through that, but the idea being Malofeyev, a wealthy tycoon, was believed to be funding this. His name comes up in the Surkov leafs as naming who should be appointed to the DPR, and as a funder as well. Alexander Borodai, who's a Russian citizen and later Russian Duma member, is appointed as the first prime minister of the Donetsk People's Republic. So if you're not aware of that, it's very well known, but my Western audience, it might be a Russian citizen who becomes a Russian Duma member was the first prime minister of the indigenous people's civil war revolution. That alone should be the end of the conversation on what's going on here. But there's much more to the story. That's just basic. On top of this, we have more from Girkin too. We'll return in a moment. This is Pavel Gubarev. He was the first governor of the Democratic Donetsk People's Republic. Yeah.
Carl, sorry, I hate to interrupt you, but we have limited time for your presentation. So if it's possible, could you speed up a little bit so we keep up with the timing? Yeah, thank you.
Okay. Yeah, sorry. So I'll speed this up real quick. So Gubarev, first governor of DPR, Donetsk People's Republic, he also tells us that it wasn't just Maidan who hated Yanukovych. He was hated and despised not only in the western parts of Ukraine, but also in the southeast. To him, it was no surprise that he brought everything to an explosion. There were people taking over factories in July 2013 in Luhansk. on the grounds that the Yanukovych clan and the Russian factory owners who are in with them were not providing enough wages, so on and so forth. So Yanukovych was despised not only by Maidan protesters, he was also despised by some of the separatists, right? It's so much more complicated than the simple narratives we're fed. But this is also really important, and I'll go through it quick. Gubarev, who's going to go to war for his his autonomy in Ukraine, was saying that we only had a handful of fighters. People were afraid to shed blood. They didn't understand it was necessary to behave as a war, and they really weren't ready, and it really wasn't going to happen. But again, he got a phone call. Who did he get a phone call from? He got it from Sergei Glazev, the advisor to Putin, and he said to Gubarev, "We support your actions in the anti-fascist struggle," and that Gubarev reports breathed new life into him, and he was now prepared to behave as in war. And we also know that Glazev was speaking to Crimean separatists, offering them money. And before Odessa, this is pretty sinister, before Odessa, he said, go take administration buildings, you're not doing enough, whip people up, and then he gave them some cash. That's a side note. So not only does Gubarev say he wasn't ready to go to war, he didn't have enough people to fight, Gherkin, who is a bit of a loose cannon, to say the least, an important figure to be careful with, he also says infamously that he triggered the war because people in Slavyansk were peaceful. They had no interest in going to war. And that story is collaborated in a book, 85 Days in Slavyansk. I have it here. If anybody's ever read it, it's a very interesting book by Zhukovsky. And he was also a separatist who's wanted by the US government for training the Russian Imperial Army. He collaborates Gherkin's story, basically saying that we had no fighters. We weren't prepared to engage in an armed revolution. And then Gherkin arrived under the cover of Gubarev, financed by Malafiev, all the same characters, and the Battle of Slavyansk began. In other words, the war began. So summary, there's considerable debate in the scholarly literature concerning the degree of Moscow's influence on the separatists before the outbreak of war. Some scholars maintain that Surkov and Glazev, Borodai, Malafiev, and others we could add were rogue actors acting on their own. I know that story from Oliver North and the Iran-Contra. Somehow the critical left knows that was nonsense, but will probably defend the Kremlin on this. Or that the Kremlin had very little control over the separatists. However, we know they had some control because they selected all the beginning leaders of this movement. They were actually Russians who did it. So the point is that Moscow was a crucial factor in fomenting and maintaining armed conflict. Obviously, it's a complicated set of factors, from economic grievances, inflated fears over oppression and a language law, bitterness toward Kyiv, mining trade with Russia, local and regional oligarchs, whether they supported or not supported the revolt, Donbass identity, aspirations to fill power vacuums, and that all commingled with Russia's clandestine operations and a tilted grievances toward armed conflict, a rebellion. But Moscow indisputably, irrefutably, beyond the shadow of a doubt, selected the separatist leadership, provided money, provided much needed encouragement, engaged in cross-border bombings as early as June 2014. So the classification of Maidan and or Yanukovych's removal as a US coup not only minimizes Ukrainian agency, it simplifies it. An adorable, lasting conflict settlement will not emerge if it adheres to Russia's foreign policy goal of destabilization through federalization. And it also diminishes, degrades, and devalues a whole new generation of growth mindset, greater tolerance, and desire for participation that can break the old Soviet mindset and chip away at layers of corruption. Thank you very much. Sorry for going over, and sorry for the rapid fire engine.
Yeah, thank you for expressing these key points. And I was thinking in the middle of the presentation that saying that CIA orchestrated the revolution in Ukraine is the same pretty much as saying that the pyramids of Egypt were built by UFO, because these theories are basically Western people not believing that someone else, like people in Egypt or people in Ukraine, could do something great themselves. So you need to come up with CIA or UFO or something like this.
Very much so.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you. Okay, then I want to remind that we have a Q&A section which you can use to write your questions. And I want to introduce Dr. Oksana Dudko. I know Oksana personally, but I think Oksana doesn't remember me because I was very young back then. And Oksana is a historian, and she studied at Lviv National Ivan Franko University, and also in Harvard Ukrainian Research Institute. And right now, yeah, she's in Canada and doing the research there. And she's a fellow Ukrainian, and I'm very happy to see her here. And I'm very, very excited to listen to her presentation. So Oksana, please start.
Thank you so much, Sasha. I do remember you, and I'm very pleased to see you. And thank you for the invite. It's a really wonderful initiative, and I'm really glad to be a part of it, at least for this panel. And today, I'd like to discuss actually the hot topic, the militarization of Ukraine, because in the news and on the streets, we often come across Ukrainians, from the President Volodymyr Zelensky to lay citizens who call to arm Ukraine. More than a year after Russia launched its invasion of Ukraine, Ukrainians call not for peace, but for arms. And as it's clear from our today's conversation, so the global community is divided along these militarization lines. Some support Ukrainians and call for more arms, whereas others emphasize for more weaponry, emphasize that more weaponry will only fuel the war instead of stopping it. So today I'd like to talk about these paradoxes of Ukrainian militarization. However, I do not want to focus on whether or not Ukraine should receive more weapons. Instead, my question is why? Why do Ukrainians call for more weapons and even more and more sophisticated offensive weaponry? Why is a country and its population, which wasn't previously engaged in any military conflict after 1991, now calling for a continuation of the war? So I'd also like to talk a bit about who in particular is calling for more weaponry. So in a broader sense, I'd like to talk about present-day Ukrainians and why they have suddenly become so militarized. So to understand Ukraine's current militarization and general call for arms, it is important to first understand Ukraine's pre-war demilitarization. And the first, as a historian and a Ukrainian who lived through the period, I'd like to talk a bit about the period of contemporary Ukrainian history. And the first thing that is important to know about Ukraine is that the contemporary generation of Ukrainians were born and raised in a demilitarized and peaceful country. The collapse of the Soviet Union and the proclamation of Ukrainian independence were a result of mass peaceful demonstrations. These demonstrations had a very festive atmosphere, and Ukrainians even brought their kids along with them, and I was one of those kids. And in fact, one of the major events that led to the collapse of the Soviet Union in Ukraine was a concert. Yes, it was a series of mass Ukrainian rock and folk concerts titled Chervona Ruta in various cities that brought the nation together and fostered a powerful anti-Soviet voice. So the proclamation of Ukrainian independence was accompanied by music, literary readings, and artistic events. Why is this so important? Because my parents' generation and our generation, my generation, who attended these events as kids, learned that political change in Ukraine is accomplished through peaceful political actions that consolidate creative energies for social change. After the full-scale invasion of Ukraine began in 2022, Many in the West wondered about the roots of Ukrainian resistance to the invasion. And my answer is that the belief in mass grassroots consolidation has been deeply ingrained in Ukrainian society. But let me get back to my story. In 1991, the Ukrainian nation was formed based on a general belief that people could peacefully protest, listen to their favorite rock band, and make one of the biggest empires in history to collapse. Ukrainian students from Kyiv and Lviv protested in Maidan Square, the Independence Square in Kyiv, and were joined by the Donbas miners. And despite having various political affiliations and distinct regional identities, Ukrainians were united by a shared belief in the power of collective action. And this belief in collective action was indeed enormous. So it was not surprise that in the early 90s, Ukrainians easily surrendered their nukes. The Soviet Union, a heavily militarized country that built its identity on the arms race with the West, collapsed. Ukrainians chose a different path. The Ukrainian army that is now at the center of all international news was almost non-existent at the time. It was associated with the repressive Soviet apparatus and the brutal Soviet system of bullying known as Dedovshchina. You might be familiar with the term, but for those of you who are not, Dedovshchina, or in Russian Dedovshchina, is an unofficial system of humiliation in the army. It is perpetrated by senior rank soldiers against junior soldiers. It can include mocking and beating and bullying and even torture. So Ukrainian society chose to let its army decline instead of reforming it. Ukrainian men, including many of my friends who were supposed to serve in the army for 1 or 2 years, did everything they could to avoid service. They either legally shirked their duties or even bribed military recruitment officers to avoid serving. So although the Ukrainian army was in decline, Ukrainian civic society was not. In 2001, another wave of peaceful protests swept across Ukraine. And these protests were triggered by the killing of Ukrainian Georgian journalist, independent journalist, Grigory Honhadze. Honhadze was a founder and editor-in-chief of one of the most important Ukrainian media outlets, Ukrainska Pravda, the Ukrainian truth. Rumors linked his killing to then Ukrainian President Leonid Kuchma. Kuchma's alleged involvement in the murder of the journalist and his corrupt regime provoked a large-scale protest, again, I emphasize peaceful protest, known as Ukraine without Kuchma. I was a student at the time, and in my hometown, these protests were centered around an underground rock club called The Doll and the local radio station titled The Initiative. Every day, students and other supporters of the protest marched along the streets, and at night they attended mass concerts and listened to the radio. These concerts and radio shows were not about politics, but about music and art, but they were by no means political. Once again, Ukrainians used a combination of artistic protest and mass demonstration to try to achieve political change. Then, two major events occurred that caught the attention of the international audience: the Orange Revolution and the Maidan, or the so-called Revolution of Dignity. So again, the Orange Revolution of 2004 was a mass, peaceful, and more importantly, successful political protest that allowed Ukrainians to defend their right to democratic elections. The corrupt Ukrainian president Leonid Kuchma, whom I've just mentioned, and the police never used force against the protesters. Once again, people gathered on the main Ukrainian square, the Maidan, organized concerts, sang, laughed, and succeeded in defending democracy in Ukraine. However, the Maidan or Revolution of Dignity of 2013 and 2014 was different. It started in a similar way with a mass peaceful protests. During this time, my friend and I were hosting a theater festival, and one of our performances ended up on the streets and almost merged with the demonstrations. You can easily find hundreds of articles about this kind of performative and even carnivalesque atmosphere of the Maidan. Consistent with tradition, Ukrainians believed in the power of peaceful protests. The Maidan protests never involved looting or street violence. Dancing, singing, creating art, and fighting for political change were once again the general ideas of the protests. However, circumstances soon changed. And please note the date. It was when Vladimir Putin was in power and he was consolidating his power in Russia. So in 2013 and 2014, snipers and riot police killed about 100 protesters in the very center of Ukraine's capital, Independence Square. Two of my friends were killed. They belonged to the generation of Ukrainians who believed in a peaceful, demilitarized Ukraine. I used to go mountaineering with one of them and did historical research with the other. For the first time, and I want to emphasize, for the first time since 1991, peaceful protests resulted in violent clashes and death, and it became clear that the Ukrainian way of life was being threatened. The Maidan, or Revolution of Dignity, was successful in a way because the political regime has changed. However, the very idea that Ukraine could be transformed politically by peaceful means was seriously challenged. And one of the largest problems that loomed for Ukraine was the Russian backing of then Ukrainian President Viktor Yanukovych. Karl just mentioned him in his presentation. Yanukovych first ordered the killing of protesters and then haphazardly fled to, note, Russia. Russia's subsequent annexation of Crimea and the beginning of the proxy war in Donbass only reinforced the Ukrainian belief that the era of peaceful protests with music and dancing had come to an end. And the use of violent methods to achieve political aims used by Russian-backed politicians, including the use of paramilitary troops and the Russian military forces without insignia, brought a new violent reality to Ukraine. At the beginning of my talk, I asked why Ukrainians were so desperate in their calls for arms. I believe that Maidan played a role. Living through peaceful protests and believing in the power of grassroots mobilization, and then witnessing the brutal killing of friends who protested for such basic human rights as freedom and dignity, cultivated the belief that Ukraine and its way of life has been existentially threatened. Facing the unprovoked killing of the members of the community, many Ukrainians, including myself, believed in our right to self-defense. Or rather our call for arms are so persistent precisely because peace does not mean the end of violence. As the Maidan killing showed, if Ukrainians were to lie down their arms and sign a peace treaty with Russia, it would not mean peace. It would mean the execution of state violence over its civilians. It would mean human rights abuses, torture, killings, and living life in constant fear. Peaceful grassroots protests with dancing and music, which were at the core of Ukrainian political mobilization, would not make any sense. That said, I'd like to make a final point about Ukrainians who call for arms. People who now call for arms belong to my generation. They are people who in 2001, 2004, and 2013 participated in peaceful protests and believed that they were the only right way to transform a country. Moreover, many not only believe in peaceful change, but were radical anti-militarists. As a historian of the First World War who reads not only about the horrors of war, but also about its horrendous consequences, I myself would teach about war as a way to fight against the militarization of societies. The idea of mutual dependency and the importance of solidarity was at the core of my teaching and research. For these Ukrainians, having to take up arms or support those who do so to fight against Russia has led to a radical identity crisis. Just over a year ago, they criticized, including myself, militarization. But now today, they call for weapons because they see no other way to survive and preserve their way of life. I believe that one of the less obvious crimes of Putin's regime is the fact that it has forced people to embrace an identity that they would never ever have embraced otherwise, and to kill other people to defend their way of life. To date, one of my friends, who was an organizer of the protests and concerts in the 2000s that I mentioned earlier, has been wounded. Another colleague, an editor and translator, was killed in December. One of my students who applied to pursue a doctorate in history in Europe just before the full-scale invasion started is now fighting on the front lines. And my colleague's husband, a filmmaker, was killed on January the 1st. All of these people never considered pursuing a military career or career that involved killing others. Not only is Ukraine devastated and suffering from the consequences of physical violence, but an entire generation of people have been forced to make a choice that they never wanted to. Someone might say that there is always a choice and that you don't have to take up arms if it's against your principles. Yes, I agree. But the choice that every single Ukrainian is making right now is to risk death rather than to live under Putin's regime. Living under the crush of Putin's regime, Ukrainians will never ever be safe. And it's not the happiest choice, I would say. Okay, I'll stop here, and I'm happy to answer your questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Oksana. Yeah, I mean, we do have a Q&A section starting right now, but I want to ask you a question using my privileges, because I don't think it will come up without me. But like sometimes people, especially in Ukraine, they like to search for the beginning of that movement, of this ability of Ukrainians to do a revolution or to do a peaceful protest, and sometimes they search for it in middle age Ukraine or something, but what is your opinion? When does it started? Roughly in the Middle Ages, in the modern times, recently? How old is the Ukrainian solidarity?
Is it a question for me? Okay, so I don't, as a historian, I don't really like to do this kind of sweeping generalizations that Ukrainian resistance started sometime in the Middle Ages with the Ukrainian Cossacks resistance against the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth or so on. So, but I think that the very concept of freedom is very, very important for every Ukrainian, and we don't have to take it for granted. So when Ukrainian freedom is threatened, Ukrainians have this very ability to consolidate, and this grassroots consolidation is very, very, very important. And as the recent protests showed, Ukrainians don't need to have a one or two specific leaders to start the mobilization campaign and to start to protest. We have this kind of grassroots networks of solidarity that, and we can very, very quickly and easily to mobilize. And I think this is a very important thing to understand about Ukraine. This is why for many Ukrainians, it's so, I would say, surprising to see so many voices that Ukrainians are manipulated by different forces, including the US government and other governments, because I think that everyone who have ever attended Ukraine would say and agree with me that we have this very powerful grassroots mobilization, and the very idea of freedom and is very, very important to every Ukrainian, and it's not that easy to manipulate Ukrainians as some people believe in the West.
Okay, yeah, thank you so much, Oksana. And in the Q&A section, Rose asked how to talk with the friends. We all have friends, so how to talk with those friends who come up with creative excuses for Putin. And I think this question could be for Carol, but also for Oksana. So I guess which arguments work, maybe? But I mean, what's your opinion in general on talking to pro-Putin friends in the West?
I took up additional time on my presentation, but thank you, Oksana, for your presentation, and sorry for taking up that extra time. So I don't want to dominate the Q&A, but I would just say it depends where they're coming from. Some people have traveled to Moscow with the anti-globalization movement and pretend to be objective, but they're clearly, connected to Moscow in ways they don't want to admit. Other people are just confused, and you can have a conversation with them. But if they're working with Russia, there's not much you can say to them.
Thank you, Carol.
Maybe remind them that the left is supposed to stand for democratic movements and stop treating the Ukrainian people like Medea Benjamin says, that they're unwitting pawns in a proxy war. Stop adopting conservative realist paradigms that this is a great powers conflict and there's no local, regional, or national interests involved. Learn a little something about geopolitics locally and regionally, I would say to those people as well. But I'm getting myself all fired up again.
Well, this is Jeff here. I'm going to jump in. I know from firsthand experience, when this war started, I didn't know much about Ukraine. When I mean the war, I mean 2022. And I was like, why are these people defending Moscow, defending Putin, making excuses? And I thought there had to be a deeper reason, but I don't think there is. It's simply that the left in the United States is relatively lazy, that for the last century, the US has been the bad guy most of the time, and that world outlook has worked, especially in Vietnam and forth. So you have these people that believe in anti-imperialism, but only anti-US imperialism, and they at least subconsciously cheer for any other force that goes up against this concept of US imperialism. And they also have a contrarian view of whatever the US or whatever the president says has to be, I have to take the opposite stand. So I think we need to like understand we are against imperialism and for self-determination and for the absolute agency of all people, but not stop at just being anti-US imperialists. We have to like stand up and in this situation, realize the world is going to be more complicated going forth and stand up to other imperialism, Russian imperialism in this case. So I'll jump out of here.
Yeah, thank you, Jeff. I think it also partly answers or fully answers the question that Matthew wrote in chat, that why events like this are rare. Events like this, I mean, this Zoom meeting, are rare in the US peace movement. But if you have something to add to this, feel free.
I would just very quickly say that why not engage Ukrainian leftists, right? There's plenty of them. They're on the internet, the Journal Commons, and also here in the US for leftists. I just met recently folks from New Politics and the Ukrainian Solidarity Campaign, and they give me some hope. They really do. And I'm very encouraged by the work that they're doing.
Thank you. I mean, also, Carl did a great job answering direct questions in the Q&A section. So I think we're done with the questions.
Well, let's take one more second, go over the Q&A. We have 15 minutes.
Okay, okay, good.
Yeah. Obviously, we're not holding anybody hostage. People can turn off Zoom at any time. But we have Carl and Oksana. I don't want to, if anybody has a question, let's take this opportunity. So there's a question by Joseph 1. He doesn't like me, and he wants to hear from Jeffrey Sachs and Noam Chomsky more. I would say that Jeffrey Sachs and Noam Chomsky are freely available. You know, you can find Noam and Mr. Sachs to no end in the left. And these 3 webinars that we have done have been a chance to highlight Ukrainian voices. You can watch the other 2 webinars and this one coming up soon, vfpukraine.org. And we intentionally are trying to highlight Ukrainian voices, and we've been criticized for that. How come we don't have more famous lefty Westerners? Well, I've heard enough of those people. I want to hear from the Ukrainians. I'm not an expert, so I'm going to Ukrainians to learn, to find out. Carl went to Ukraine to find out. John Spitzberg, who opened the show, went to Ukraine to find out what was really going on. Somebody asked a question about funding. The funding for these webinars have come from, well, Courage to Resist, which is the organization I directed. We're a collective dedicated to supporting war resistors, and through our work supporting Russian war resistors that have landed in the U.S. in the last 15 or so months, we've become concerned about this war. We also support Ukrainian war resistors, but there's fewer of them, and there's no moral equivalency between invading a country and choosing to fight or not fight in self-defense. So, you know, we have been able to raise a few $1,000s to donate to the Feminist Workshop, to Women for Women Foundation in Ukraine, and to provide our Ukrainian panelists a small token honorariums. So we're proud to have done that. Now people can go to UNAC and other alleged left progressive organizations or whatever, and you could hear from Scott Ritter, you know, a former UN weapons inspector who happens to be a 3-time convicted child sexual predator. You can go to UNAC and learn from the Huru movement, who have been indicted for actually taking money from the Russian government to propagate propaganda in the left here in the United States, or you can listen to progressive Ukrainians. So that's what we're trying to do here. And I don't know if we succeeded, but it's the effort that counts in my concern. So if there's no more questions, I would just say, let's go around one more time. If there's closing remarks from Oksana or Sasha or Carl. And I just want to thank everybody on behalf of the Veterans for Peace Ukraine Working Group that will probably be banned by our leadership in the coming weeks. You'll still be able to find us at vfpukraine.org and courage2resist.org. And we'll find out some other way to organize and stand in real peace solidarity with the people of Ukraine fighting for their self-determination against a vicious, brutal, horrific invasion by their neighbor to the east. So, Carl, and then we'll just go backwards. Thanks.
Okay, I guess I'll go back to the question about Jeffrey Sachs and Noam Chomsky. I find that the people I interact with here in the States on Ukraine rarely ever turn to a Ukrainian scholar or even a regional expert, even an American US regional expert. And it's interesting, the sources they go to are really people who, morally speaking, are highly questionable. Jeffrey Sachs helped engage in shock therapy and destroy the Russian economy, of course, with the Russian leadership stealing IMF loans with the IMF's knowledge and laundering the money through a New York bank. And in return for those loans, they agreed to NATO expansion. And you're going to listen to Jeffrey Sachs, who's trying to retroactively reinvent himself as though he's some sort of liberating force. I think we can do better than that. I'd be happy to debate Jeffrey Sachs, Noam Chomsky, John Mearsheimer, Medea Benjamin. I'm just a Long Island bodybuilder who became a professor, and they can't answer me. I debated Chomsky, who I also don't want to engage in dialogue. He's busy hobnobbing with Jeffrey Epstein in his apartment when he's critiquing the global capitalist system. He's hanging out with a hedge fund manager who's the world's most notorious pedophile. These are your sources that you want to. I did dialogue with Noam Chomsky, and he said to me that Zelensky betrayed his peace platform. And I said, what did he betray? He goes, well, he has a no concession stance, and the right wing made him betray it. And I said, have you even read the so-called peace platform? Have you read his election platform? No, but it's irrelevant. So I sent it to him, and he didn't betray it. It says that the territories that are occupied in Crimea and Donbass are non-negotiable. And Chomsky's answer was, oh, this should be publicized for the first time. Publicized for the first time. Millions of Ukrainians have seen it for years. Just because you learned of it, it's not. But that's this sort of arrogance and just lack of knowledge and uninformed on Ukraine. I don't know why you'd want to dialogue with those people. I would, but for the purpose of debating them. But they're not knowledgeable on Ukraine, and they have some moral questions about their character.
Oksana, any closing thoughts for us?
Yeah. Thank you so much. I think that people just like to read, including myself, like to read things that just reinforce their beliefs. So, but for those people who are genuinely curious about Ukraine, I do encourage to learn Ukrainian history, listen to Ukrainian voices. It's really important to build a kind of sensitivity to the topic. And I think that once you are familiarized with what Ukrainians think about this conflict, it will change your perspective on the things. So as a historian, I do encourage you to learn Ukrainian history and just be curious and be sensitive. So yeah, and thank you so much for organizing this event.
Jeff, may I make one comment?
Oh, we forgot about John. Hey, John.
Yeah, I've been here all along, except for a telephone call. I want to tell you a quick story. On my last night in Odessa at the hotel, I was very upset with somebody's television set because I kept hearing boom, boom, boom. And I made the assumption that they were listening or watching, rather, a movie, a war movie. And I wondered why he wouldn't, or she wouldn't, turn it down. Well, about an hour and a half later, it stopped and I fell asleep. Found out the next day that the harbor and the airport at Odessa had been attacked. That's tragic. It's tragic for the children. It's tragic for the families. I am no scholar like the four of you. I'm just another guy on the street. But from my point of view, we have a duty to take the side of those who are bullied, not the bullier. And that is why I'm so completely incensed with what is going on in VFP, and why I believe without question that the Ukrainians have the right to have people on their side, help them in any way we can to fight off the bully. I realize I'm no scholar, but there you are. Thank you.
Thanks, John. You're not the only one who thinks Veterans for Peace should also include justice. And many of us thought that was simply implied. Sasha, let's wrap this up for us. And anyways, thanks everyone.
Yeah, thanks everyone. I had some thoughts. Oh, I don't know if you can hear me well. This was a noise. Okay. Sorry. First thing, I would say that because Chomsky has this Slavic surname, I think he was a bit popular among Ukrainian students from my experience, and especially like first, second year. And a lot of Ukrainians would write papers on them, like their year work or something. Back then, maybe, I don't know, 7 years ago, 10 years ago, because he was intriguing for them. But of course, with his positions on the war, a lot of Ukrainians were shocked, stunned, surprised, and they learned this lesson that sometimes there are these authorities, constructed figures of fathers who we need to adore, and you learn that your own experience is more important. And I think this is, it's not that anyone gets to learn. Like for some people, it takes longer time. But I would encourage that the critical practice. Yeah. And the second thing is also, I wanted to say that a lot of Ukrainians speak good English and they're pretty vocal. They do a lot of explanation, they do a lot of podcasts. So it shouldn't be hard to find as much information on the current situation and on history. Yeah, so we are working, and we are like to have audiences from the whole world. Thank you so much.
Thanks, everyone. That is the end of our event today. Visit vfpukraine.org to watch a recording of this. Give me a day or so to do some quick edits. So anyways, appreciate everybody, and good night.